Resident Evil has always been a series of contrasts. On the one hand, its stories primarily revolve around horrific biotechnological disasters that claim countless innocent lives, driven by an unchecked private corporation who believe they're worthy of playing God. Its characters are frequently plunged into terrifying scenarios and sometimes meet humiliating ends while trying to save others or simply survive themselves. From child abuse and experimentation to religious conformity and cult worship, it doesn't seem like there's a dark or serious subject that the series has yet to tackle in its distinctive gooey mutates style. On the other hand, you have grown men punching boulders, giant spooky snake bosses, and dialogue like this.
I have been honored with the prodigious power from the great Lord Sadler. I've been expecting you, my brethrens.
No thanks, bro.
The series has always straddled the boundary between serious, scary horror game and schlocky B-movie, exploring both sides of this coin with astounding sincerity. There's no witty, Marvel movie-style self-reference in these games, where the writers try to say, look, we want you to know that the events happening on screen are ludicrous. We don't actually want you to take this seriously. Nope, Resident Evil just presents whichever new crazy character, mutation, or set piece it wants, fully free of irony, and hey, if the player decides to make a joke out of it, that's on them. Though these elements might sometimes go so far over the top that they end up being laughable, I've got a lot of respect for this mindset. It shows that the developers at least respect what they do and what they create, and ultimately a fluctuating tone can help in keeping the games fresh and interesting. This might just be me, but I don't play the Resident Evil games to get creeped out and scared. I like the themes that it explores, and more relevant to this video, the inventive character and monster designs. And Resident Evil Village, the 8th mainline iteration in a series with multiple spin-offs, truly hits the mark, with its central antagonists being some of the most unique characters that the series has ever had. The Four Lords are imposing and threatening, yet in their own way offbeat and charming. This strange combination, not usually seen in modern horror games, merits further analysis. Hence, this video. Before we start, I should say that there will be big spoilers for most of Village's story in here, as well as discussions about mental illness, and the general violence and gore you'd expect from a video about Resident Evil. With that out of the way, let's take a closer look at this happy family. The Four Lords are Village's defining characters, featuring heavily in the game's marketing and being the crucial driving force for the game's main story. They're direct underlings of the main villain, Mother Miranda, acting as sort of guards that Ethan has to defeat in order to rescue his daughter, or at least her still living severed body parts. It's complicated. Those of you that have watched a lot of anime might be noticing some similarities between the role the Four Lords play and the old shonen trope where the main villain is hidden behind several powerful underlings. When I first saw the Four Lords introductory cutscene, I couldn't help but smile at how reminiscent it was. As the Lords argued over who should get to deal with Ethan, all I could think of was that familiar scene from animes like One Piece or Naruto, where you have an ensemble cast of villains meeting up for the sole purpose of introducing themselves. It's an overused trope in anime, so much so that even the most hardcore otaku can't help but make fun of it if the opportunity arises. That said, the concept of having these four powerful underlings works incredibly well in Village, and helps give the game a unique sense of character that sets it apart from other games in the series. This is only enhanced by the fact that the Four Lords don't only work as Mother Miranda's underlings, but are also considered her close family. So, naturally, they argue and insult each other just like any other group of unruly siblings would, undercutting and interrupting each other as they vie for Miranda's favour. This couldn't possibly be demonstrated better than in the cutscene where we meet the Lords for the first time, and form our first impressions of them. Angie and Moreau huddle around Ethan, pushing each other out of the way and struggling to get a look at the new arrival. They act like curious little kids, eager to check out something new, and excitedly run back to the others once Ethan wakes up. Lady Dimitrescu and Heisenberg, on the other hand, sit further up with Mother Miranda, observing from afar like they're at the grown-ups table. It's clear that these two see each other as rivals, as the most mature siblings, but nonetheless they bicker like any two children would. Both even call each other out for being childish, not realizing that they're both acting hilariously immature for two presumed adults. It's a really strange contrast to be playing a horror game and to be introduced to these scary and intimidating villains, only to see them just argue with each other. And yet, this is the perfect example of the balance between scary and quirky that I was talking about in the intro. Just because a game is classed as a horror game doesn't mean that its characters have to be dour, depressing, and single-minded individuals. They can have eccentric and distinctive personalities, clothing, and goals, and still manage to fill the player with a sense of dread. This dread comes partly from the fact that we're not used to seeing characters like this in a horror game. We can't just roll our eyes at the appearance of another giant zombie or enigmatic corporate schemer and go through the same motions we're used to. These are characters with their own unique objectives and methods, and we're going into this completely blind. However, it is true that Resident Evil has previously included coalitions of villains working together, sometimes under a centralized leader. In Resident Evil 4, Bitores Mendez, Ramon Salazar, and Osmond Sadler all work together as the upper echelons of Los Iluminados, with Sadler being the unifying force leading the trio. However, these three are only really introduced to us as we proceed through the game. The first obstacle is Mendez, then Salazar, and so on, so they only really have any presence in the chapter that they're introduced. Sadler is really the only villain from Resi 4 who maintains a constant presence throughout the story, and you'd hope so because he's the main villain. Very early on, Village makes it clear that these four are the primary antagonistic force that we're going to be dealing with, setting the tone for the adventure to come. We know right from the start that we're trespassing in enemy territory, and the game doesn't wait long to show us the terrifying implications of our actions. As we're dropped helpless in front of these intimidating figures, we immediately know that we've screwed up. And these four are the ones that are going to hold us responsible. Is the freaky fishman going to eat me? Am I going to get hunted by the Bloodborne guy? Is the tall lady gonna step on me? From this point on, whenever the player moves into a new area governed by one of these lords, we do it with a sense of anxiety, made worse by the fact that we've been introduced to this area's lord already. We know enough about the lord from this intro cutscene to form initial expectations about what they're like, but not enough that we can feel truly prepared for what's coming up. While at first this intro cutscene may seem like a silly scene ripped straight out of a cliched anime, it plays an important role in setting up the scares and tension that we're going to be feeling very soon. I think at this point I've made it pretty clear that I love the Four Lords as a concept, and I do think they make their mark on the series in a dominant way, but obviously there's more to each of them than just this introduction. Each have their own individual motives and ways of doing things, and we couldn't do a video about these guys without looking at each of them and seeing how they function on their own. And who better to analyse first than the 9'6" lady of the castle, Alcina Dimitrescu. Lady Dimitrescu was never intended to serve as the game's flagship character, and the dev team was surprised to see that she and her daughters had gained so much popularity prior to Village's release. The furthest I can trace this back is a tweet from one of my fave YouTubers, the Spear Hunter, who was, I believe, the first big name to point out that the so-called vampire lady was, in fact, extremely tall. From there, the chorus of Tall Lady Heart rang out across Twitter and beyond, and pretty soon the entire internet knew exactly who Lady D was, whether they liked it or not. Looking back, it is kind of strange that the dev team didn't see exactly what kind of phenomenon they created. But as they say, hindsight is 20/20, and you can't always predict what new craze the internet's gonna hop onto next, even if they surely knew what they were doing with these proportions. But there's more to this character than her hourglass figure, and the overemphasis on her body risks simplifying what makes her such a compelling character, even in the relatively short amount of screen time she's given. However, it's difficult to ignore her overall look. Wearing a long, flowing gown with an almost comically oversized hat, Dimitrescu looks completely anachronistic. The game's concept art notes mention that her dress sense is based on Christian Dior's New Look style of fashion from the 1960s, a style that emphasized a fairly tight upper body, then a long flowing skirt from the waist down. The internet also managed to find this photo from 1938, which looks like direct, almost identical inspiration for Lady D. I'd be very surprised if this wasn't used for at least a reference. Either way, her fashion sense is completely out of sync with the present day setting of the game, and was even considered out of sync during the time in which it originated. Back in the mid-20th century, the feminist movement was gaining more and more ground, and protesters saw the new look attire as being restrictive, meant to emphasize an outdated view of femininity. Even fellow fashion designer Coco Chanel thought that Dior's new styles were old hat. Whatever your opinion of the new look movement itself, Lady D's adoption of this dress sense heavily emphasizes her identity as an unchanging, eternal being. She's a member of an ancient noble family, a literal immortal vampire, and a woman who adopts fashion styles which were antiquated even in the time of their origin. Her very style firmly reinforces her as a stubborn and unshakable monolith, a relic from the past who still maintains her age-old power in exactly the way she wants to. And boy does she know it. While each of the four lords are the head of their respective house, it's Lady D that firmly embraces the role of high and mighty aristocrat. No pun intended. While she's theoretically an equal to the other four lords, Lady D believes that she's far superior to her contemporaries, and, indeed, to most other individuals she meets. During their meeting, when Miranda decides that Heisenberg will be the one to take care of Ethan, Alcina is the only one to argue against Miranda, a woman who is above her in the village hierarchy. A diary entry found in her room shows where Dimitrescu thinks she stands. Miranda gave her eternal life and the castle she currently inhabits. Therefore, she must consider Lady D to be her favourite. This egotism extends to her immediate family too. Though she does display genuine regard and affection for her daughters, they are also very clearly subservient to her, and follow her instructions without question. Her self-assuredness comes across especially effectively in the player's encounters with her. Despite being an enemy intended to pursue the player, the lady takes her time, advancing towards Ethan in long, patient strides. If a minor enemy gets in her way, she shoves them aside without so much as a glance in their direction. Though you can draw blood by damaging her, nothing you do will cause her to do anything more than slightly wince. With all of this combined, here's your situation. You're in her castle, she's better than you, and she wants you to know it. However, this isn't the full story. While Lady D is set up as an aristocrat and portrayed as such, the game challenges her narcissism and conceit in some subtle and some not so subtle ways, lending more depth to her character and presentation. Firstly, her very status as a noble is far from settled. Though she is the last member of House Dimitrescu, the game hints that she or her family may not have always lived in the castle. Mother Miranda's notes on Alcina, for example, mention that she is not from the village. At first, I thought this was simply a reference to how she instead lived in a castle, separate to the people she'd see as riffraff. However, as I mentioned earlier, Dimitrescu's personal diary mentions that Miranda gave the castle to her, implying that she or her family hadn't had possession of the castle before Miranda took control of the village. While this might just be an issue with how these notes are worded or translated, I think there's enough evidence there to assume that Lady D hadn't inherited the castle and had possibly left or been driven from it altogether. If this is indeed the truth, then she's hardly the old money divinely appointed by birth ruler that she portrays herself as being, and in fact recovered her family's castle solely through Miranda's good graces, or, more likely, so that Miranda could have a powerful figure watching over the region. What's more, while she views herself as being above those who live in the village, Dimitrescu is completely reliant on them for her continued existence. Due to her blood disease, she must regularly consume human flesh and blood to maintain her ability to regenerate and keep her mutation under control. Without literally ingesting those that she views as an underclass, Lady D wouldn't be able to survive at all. She physically can't be self-sufficient, and so her nobility hangs precariously on the edge, completely dependent on others. But the most apparent deconstruction of her noble and refined identity arrives right at the end, where Ethan manages to stab her with a poisoned knife and mutates her into a colossal, hideous, draconic entity. This truly beastly form is miles away from the distinguished persona that Lady D normally projects, resembling something like Berserk's ghastly apostles, or, to get more obscure, the awakened beings from Claymore. In this mode, her human form is shrunk away, relegated to a comparatively small section of the monster's back. With her legs and arms having been incorporated into the monster's form, all that remains of the character we've seen till this point is her torso and head, both of which are almost completely unrecognizable. She relentlessly attacks Ethan atop one of her castle's battlements, screeching and laughing wildly, with no hint of aristocracy or dignity left.
Bones! I will devour all of you!
man, wait, what was I saying? The part of her that was noble has almost totally disappeared, subsumed into the bloodthirsty monster that Lady Dimitrescu truly is. When Ethan defeats her, her fall from grace is complete, literally, with Dimitrescu falling from the very top of the tower straight into a forgotten, abandoned dungeon. Though she thought herself to be above everyone else in the village, Alcina Dimitrescu ends her life down below. But despite her arrogant demeanour, gruesome appetite, and unrepentant actions, there's still a sympathetic element to her character. Alcina still, even as a great and powerful ruler, suffers from anxiety over her place in Miranda's affections, hoping that the village leader prizes her over the other lords, and worrying that she might not be as esteemed by her mother as she hopes. What's more, though her daughters are completely subservient to her will and were created through essentially killing and recreating innocent young women, Lady D holds a great deal of love and affection for them. She expresses gratitude when the daughters catch Ethan, screams with anguish upon realizing one of them is dead, and evokes them specifically when venting her rage on our protagonist. She even wears 3 small roses on her dress that represent her girls, keeping them not only figuratively but also literally close to her heart. Both of these examples point to a crucial desire at Lady Dimitrescu's core, the longing for a close, loyal family relationship. While family is a key theme throughout the game, Alcina is the lord who most desires, and actively works towards forming such a social unit, as twisted as the final result may be. Perhaps she fears being alone once more, cast out into the cold, as she presumably was before Miranda showed up. She's the last of her bloodline as far as we can tell, and, as a result, most likely endured a dispassionate and solitary upbringing. This is the final, tragic piece that reveals her elite attitude for what it truly is, a facade covering up a woman whose life was empty, and who knows, deep down, how easily it might all just slip away. Lady D is my favourite member of the Four Lords, and I imagine she holds that position for most of the fanbase as well. The dev team, actor and models did amazing jobs of making her look, sound and feel like the dignified yet vicious lord she was always meant to be, and I have no doubt that her design will ensure she lives on as one of the most iconic Resident Evil characters. Maybe even one of the most iconic video game characters too. But, interesting as she may be, she's not the only interesting character out of the Four Lords. From the bold and brash theatre of nobility, we enter the furtive world of Donna Beneviento. The enigmatic Beneviento is a doll maker living deep in a misty valley just outside the village. She's definitely the lord with the least time in the spotlight, with most of her talking being done through her creepy looking homemade doll, Angie. I actually didn't even know Donna existed until the game released and people started mentioning her, so far out of the spotlight does she dwell, and at first there seems to be nothing interesting or notable about her at all. Unless, of course, you're really into goth girls, which, well, fair enough. But there's plenty to discuss about Beneviento, both in her overall aesthetic design and also in the lore surrounding her. Her face is seen only twice, once in a portrait and once at the end of her life, and she speaks only one voice line.
Don't leave. I can't let you.
Not counting the myriad times she speaks through her doll Angie, who has a decidedly straightforward and simple personality. As a result, a lot of what her character represents has to be read and interpreted from her design and other details that the game gives us. While it may seem unnecessarily enigmatic, this actually makes these two all the more rewarding to talk and think about. I've identified 2 primary elements that make up her character overall, and, interestingly enough, element number 1 is duality, the idea of 2 binary aspects set in opposition. Firstly, we can see it in how Donna and Angie are dressed. Donna wears clothes more suited to a funeral, with a veil covering her entire head, and long dark robes covering the rest of her body. These clothes symbolize the end of life and the closing of a story, implying that she is, as the concept art notes state, little more than a ghost. Angie, on the other hand, wears a wedding dress symbolizing new beginnings and new life. Though her master's life might symbolically be over, Angie's dressed and ready to live on in her place, rushing around and cackling wildly as people do when they get married, don't they? Duality is also reflected in the Beneviento house crest, which takes the form of a paired sun and moon. The crest is, in return, reflected in the very faces of the characters themselves, with half of Angie's face covered by a moon and half of Donna's face covered by a parasitic growth. Angie's face seems specifically designed to represent House Beneviento, and acts as an icon of authority while her owner is amongst the Four Lords. Donna may be a ghost, but her ancestral inheritance certainly isn't. To analyse Donna's face, however, we need to get a bit more metaphorical. The growth we can see on the right side is a result of her cadeau, the parasite implanted in her by Mother Miranda, mutating out of control. By growing specifically over this side, it's taken the place of the moon symbol on Angie's face and on the Beneviento crest, turning Donna herself into an embodiment of duality. It's a constant reminder that she carries within herself both human and mutant identities. But, unlike Lady Dimitrescu, she's never more one than the other. Dimitrescu was a bloodthirsty, savage beast masquerading as human, and Donna just isn't the same. She has no out-of-control, giant mutated form, yet still possesses a visible reminder that she's not fully human. She is both identities equally balanced within one individual. But there's more to Donna's duality than just her dress sense. Rather than simply being an aesthetic choice that links together Donna, Angie, and the family crest designs, duality is something that permeates Donna's very being. The game's lore tells us that Donna had difficulties engaging socially from a young age. A report from Miranda reveals that Donna possesses a severe mental illness and is mentally underdeveloped, and a note from the Beneviento's gardener sheds light on why. The gardener notes that Donna had always feared others due to a scar on her face, pointing at an affliction that would have prevented her from engaging socially and thus developing important life skills. He goes on to say that Donna eventually withdrew from the world entirely after the death of her parents, choosing only to speak to Angie, the doll her father had left her. Eventually, she would then come to use her parasite to manipulate Angie remotely, allowing the doll to speak to others so that she didn't have to. It seems that her parents' death is what really triggered the break in her personality, causing Donna to retreat behind her veil and move Angie, a loud and boisterous puppet, into the spotlight. The game doesn't confirm if the doll is supposed to be a separate character altogether, or simply an accurate reflection of her master's true personality, and I don't think there's enough evidence for either side to be truly conclusive. On one hand, Angie is the only way in which Donna engages with the world, and considering the puppeteer's psyche might well be that of a child's, Angie's excitable nature could easily just be what Donna would say if she were able. On the other hand, Donna herself is still a physical force in the world, picking up Angie and holding her like a child. In her soul voice line, Donna also exhibits a different personality to Angie, acting desperate and anxious. Ultimately, I think both arguments are correct. Angie is a separate force to her master, yet still contains Donna's will and motivation within her. The two characters share the same goals and objectives, yet are still separate beings. This is the ultimate manifestation of duality within her. Though she is one entity, her mind and body are split into two separate beings who can't exist without each other. Donna Beneviento is duality, from her attire to her face, right down to the very depths of her identity. At this point, it's easy to have a huge amount of sympathy for the character. When I first played through the game, I felt sorry for Donna as she's clearly had a very hard life, compounded by a mental illness that's made it impossible for her to move past the traumatic events of her childhood. However, her past cannot excuse every action that she takes in the present, and I don't think you can blame all of her actions on her mental illness. People in our world have had conditions like Donna's, but they haven't killed people because of it. The illness may have channeled Donna's approach to the world in a certain direction, but it can't be held responsible for all of her actions. However, this doesn't mean that she hasn't been influenced in some other way, and the source of this mysterious influence is as clear as, well, the look on her face. Beneviento's face resembles her family crest, as we've discussed, and the parasite is specifically placed where the moon section of the crest would be. And where the parasite symbolizes the moon, it also symbolizes everything that the moon itself has traditionally represented. Where the sun is usually associated with rationality and truth, the moon embodies madness and lack of reason. As the parasite grows over Donna's face, we can see that her human side has slipped away, slowly overtaken by a darker and more sinister force. It's this force that, prior to the start of the game, enabled Donna to gain something that had eluded her throughout her life. Something ruthlessly stripped away from her through circumstances beyond her grasp, but returned to her in the form of her parasitic abilities. This thing is the second element that defines her character, the need for control. Donna is not only a talented doll maker, having designed a myriad of the creepy things to decorate her manor, but also, as we've seen with Angie, a skilled puppeteer. She's able to control her parasite remotely, allowing her to manipulate her dolls freely, and can also throw her voice convincingly enough to make Angie sound completely different to her. Through the parasite, she's able to live on through her companion more convincingly than if she'd simply held Angie on her knee like a normal ventriloquist. By puppeteering her from afar, Donna is able to instill a presence of her own and still interact with the world from a distance, regaining a level of control over her life and identity previously lost to tragedy. It would be heartwarming and sweet if this was the extent of her control, but sadly, this character isn't so innocent. Beneviento doesn't physically attack Ethan herself, and possesses no grand, super powerful mutated form with which to do battle. However, we do learn that, as well as the dolls, she's also able to manipulate a particular kind of flower, and induce powerful hallucinations in anyone who breathes in its pollen. As Ethan approaches her manor, he falls under the influence, being overtaken by images of paranoia about his wife and child. As he makes his way through the Beneviento house, he's confronted with further illusions, seeing images of Mia walking through the halls and forced to perform an impromptu autopsy on a doll created as a simulacrum of his presumed deceased wife. The illusions worsen, and, in the sequence's infamous and terrifying conclusion, his anxieties about Rose's condition manifest in the form of Baby, a distorted, eldritch abomination against which, due to him hallucinating the loss of his weapons, Ethan has no defense. While we can't see Donna physically throughout this sequence, it's clear that she either set up the workshop as a means to influence Ethan's thought process, or simply manipulated his consciousness to make him visualize everything down there himself. Whichever is true, we know she's the one behind everything that's going on, staying at a distance and pulling the strings so that everything turns out in her favour. Therefore, her control extends from Ethan the character to the player themselves. While Ethan is being influenced by Donna's illusions, we can't freely explore the manor in the way that we want to. Outside in the garden, areas that Donna doesn't want us to explore are completely blocked off, forcing us to use the path she's chosen. In the manor's basement, where the player and Ethan are fully in the palm of Beneviento's hand, we have little to no freedom whatsoever, forced to extract items from the Mia doll, open doors, and solve puzzles in a specific order. We can only go to the destinations Donna has chosen in the order she's chosen them. It's only at the end, when Ethan escapes the monstrous baby and makes his way back upstairs, that Donna begins to panic. After Ethan overcomes her elusive dungeon, her control over his consciousness starts to slip. She reveals herself to him and, in one final attempt to contain him within the manor, forces Ethan to play a deadly game of hide and seek with Angie. This last resort shows the extent to which Donna struggles if she loses her control, with her mastercrafted illusions replaced by a panicked attempt to stall Ethan, at least long enough for her to control her knife-wielding dolls and incapacitate him. Her final resistance shows the dollmaker struggling to hold on to the illusion, her parasitic infection manifesting in Angie as Ethan drives a pair of scissors through her. His target, in reality, being Donna's face. She tried everything at her disposal to keep Ethan away, suspend him at the end of her strings like the puppet she's so used to manipulating, but in the end, once her control over him was broken, her plans fatally unraveled. This need for control could easily be read as something that grew out of Beneviento's mental illness. Without the ability to explore much of the outside world, she settles on being master of her own very small area of it, having complete dominance over the manor and everything in it. Regardless, I'm not inclined towards a sympathetic interpretation. Donna has used this mastery to torture and terrorize anyone who falls into her web, having been notorious for doing so even before Ethan arrives. The evidence is written in a diary found just outside the manor, in a small home belonging to the Beneviento family's gardener. The gardener clearly held Donna in high regard and was concerned for her mental health. As a result, he's overjoyed to hear that Mother Miranda adopted Donna as one of her children. He apparently also had a good relationship with his lord, as Donna happily used Angie to chat to him about the gift that Mother Miranda had given her. However, the diary ends on a dark note, with the gardener recalling how Beneviento had given him some yellow flowers to plant in the garden. Having done so, she then tells the gardener to meet her at the manor the next day, with the promise that he'll be able to meet his family once again. Given the gardener's disappearance, plus the horrific images Ethan sees when he's reunited with his family, we can only assume that the gardener met a truly grim fate, along with anyone else who dared visit the Beneviento manor. The Duke, in his introduction to the Four Lords, mentions that none of Donna's playmates have ever come back from her estate. Clearly there have been multiple cases of people going to Beneviento's manor, falling under her power, and eventually meeting the same fate as the gardener. My interpretation of her actions is a simple one. Overjoyed with achieving some sort of control in her life, Donna used it in the most sadistic way possible, by turning people into puppets for her house of horror, and playing with them until their minds and bodies eventually expired. There are multiple interpretations of Donna's motives besides this very negative one. Maybe she really did wish the best for the gardener and thought she was helping him. In the process, maybe she caused the death of a dear friend entirely by accident. You can imagine that, having lost all of her own family, she would sympathize with anyone in the same position, be it the gardener or even Ethan. We can see her curiosity towards Ethan's family by looking at the photo he gives her in order to enter the manor. Before entering, the back of the photo is completely covered in grime. Following Donna's death, we retrieve the photo, only to find that the grime has been wiped away to reveal a message from Mia. Take care of our little Rose. This was clearly Donna's doing, intrigued by the kind of family our protagonist belongs to, as someone who no longer has that kind of bond. But if Beneviento truly sympathizes with others in the same situation, the terrifying illusions she subjects them to certainly doesn't do anything to show it. To me, it reads more as Donna projecting her own internal darkness on anyone who might be in a similar situation, and I don't think there's enough evidence to view her any more sympathetically than this. Her backstory is undeniably tragic, but everything she did afterwards is the work of a truly villainous being. A character with an identity split in two, who's nonetheless able to command a nightmarish theatre of dread. Donna Beneviento is a complex lady indeed. Despite having the least dialogue of all four lords, I found her by far the most fascinating. She's a character who does elicit a great deal of sympathy, but at the same time is probably the most misanthropic and sinister figure in the game, and there's that duality again. She doesn't play the game like any other character in the series, and her psychology informs the way her character is presented in a really interesting way. With Donna done, let's move on to a far simpler character. There's no hidden meaning or dual identity to worry about here. With Salvatore Moreau, what you see is what you get. Out of all of the lords, Moreau is the one who stands out as the most stereotypically monstrous. With his enormous hunched back, distorted face and simple speech, he initially seems to be the token generic monster man, sticking out like a sore thumb among his peers. His hideous mutation masks an undeniably tragic figure, and one who elicits genuine sympathy. His character is someone who, having fallen so far from his former position, desperately attempts to regain some sense of stature, to no avail. Moreau lives alone on a reservoir just outside the village, dwelling primarily in a small, ramshackle room with only a static TV and a jarred Cadeau parasite to keep him company. While we don't know what he looked like prior to receiving the Cadeau implant, we can probably assume it was a far sight more human than the wretched creature we can see now. Moreau's mutation thoroughly ruined him, warping much of his body into a mass of eyes, tentacles, and leaking flesh. This isn't all. The parasite seems to have also greatly affected his intellectual capacity. Prior to receiving the implant, Moreau was presumably a scientist or doctor, given the signs that point to a clinic around the reservoir in which he dwells. Miranda notes that his brain function is now surprisingly low, implying that she had expected him to exhibit higher levels of intelligence after receiving the Cadeau, and hinting at a higher intellect pre-exposure. Concept art mentions that his brain has partly grown into his back due to the mutation, physically distorting it and likely causing permanent damage in the process. All of this combines into a downtrodden and unfortunate character who has lost his humanity both physically and mentally, and no longer looks like the mighty lord of the region he presumably was before. As a result, he's treated as inferior by the other lords, with Angie especially openly insulting and pushing him around in front of Mother Miranda. In one of his diary entries, he mentions that no one likes him and they've left him out of their activities before, showing a consistent process of the Lord shunning Moreau altogether. Despite the fact that he's mostly dismissed by the others, Moreau constantly tries to defy their expectations and recover the sense of dignity that his condition denies him. The fractured-looking headpiece he wears is a crown made out of the bones of former villagers, a heart-rendingly childlike, though morbid, attempt by Moreau to help himself feel like he's genuinely one of the village's rulers. He also depends closely on Miranda, whom he refers to affectionately as Mother, for esteem and regard. Unlike Heisenberg and Dimitrescu, who openly argue and question her judgment in her presence, Moreau acts more like a quiet, well-behaved son, clearly having a great amount of affection and respect for her. His life is earnestly focused on gaining this respect, to the point at which he suffers a mental breakdown upon realizing that Miranda may abandon him once her deceased child is resurrected. As with the castle she gave to Dimitrescu, Miranda granted Moreau a mountain which he uses as a laboratory, trying to grow strong vessels for her ceremony and thus earn her pride by his own actions. In the diary entries chronicling these experiments, we can see that there still remain traces of the man Moreau used to be. One of these entries specifies that Miranda brought in the subjects for these experiments at his request, showing that not only are these operations self-directed, but Moreau, even after his mutation, still had some idea of what to do with the subjects. While there's no physical evidence of these operations, and Moreau could just be mindlessly hacking people up, it seems more likely that he's using his former medical knowledge that still exists in fragments somewhere within his mind. We can see evidence of this in his recollections of the operations, where he talks about anesthetizing and cutting open the stomachs of several villagers before planting parasites inside. Another diary entry shows that he knows the procedure for injecting fluid into an individual's spine, similar to a lumbar puncture. Now, while anyone could theoretically have a shot at these haphazard experiments, even me, the subjects only died on the following day, showing they lived for at least a little while. Here we can see that Moreau was not only specifically trying to keep them alive, but also had an idea of how to perform the procedures so that his subjects would survive them. While the experiments did mostly end up as failures, we can still see him applying his skills and expertise at a highly reduced capacity in an attempt to make Mother proud. When Ethan Winters shows up at his reservoir, having already dispatched 2 of his fellow lords, Moreau sees a new opportunity to redeem himself by killing the new bane of their village. Their first encounter is another good example of how Moreau, despite his diminished intelligence, still displays a level of cunning and smarts. The encounter initially goes quite badly, as Moreau seemingly forgets to hide away the piece of rose that Miranda had entrusted to him, and allows Ethan to simply sneak up behind him and take it. However, in the twist of the century, knowing Ethan will underestimate him, Moreau distracts him, keeping Ethan talking just long enough for him to flood the entrance to the reservoir with mucus. However, this is definitely the highlight of Moreau's attempts to stop Ethan, and it's in this reservoir that we come to learn just how little power over his fate he has. While Lady Dimitrescu couldn't fully control her mutation under duress, she still possessed some level of agency otherwise, able to maintain her human form in most circumstances. Moreau, on the other hand, seems hard-pressed to keep his mutation in when met with even the slightest provocation, vomiting and collapsing into the reservoir when Ethan next confronts him. His mutated form does possess a huge amount of strength, being one of the only things in the game capable of killing Ethan in one hit. It's also capable of smashing a cabin to pieces as if it were paper, and can launch itself out of the water and a good distance into the air. But despite its pure physical force, even this form doesn't let up, telling us just how little power Moreau has over even his own body. In the water, the monster can only manage to fling itself around with a considerable lack of finesse, and Ethan only has to power the reservoir and drain all of the water for Moreau to lose a considerable amount of advantage. After losing the place where his mutation could be put to best use, the Lord flees the area, until Ethan corners him in a small fishing hamlet nearby. It's here that we can see what Moreau's fully mutated form looks like, an amphibious creature that's part fish, part salamander, and fully atrocious. Like Donna, in this state Moreau resembles a warped version of his family crest, which depicts a beast similar to a mermaid. However, while Donna was an embodiment of the duality within the crest, she still maintained her own appearance and identity. The same most assuredly can't be said of Moreau. His mutated form has completely overtaken and even engulfed him, with his mostly human body relegated to a humiliating position within the creature's mouth. In this form, we can see his true standing within the Four Lords and what he truly means to Miranda. With his body and mind ruined, this warped depiction of his family's lineage is all that remains, living on as a mockery of the Moreau family's noble origins, as a pawn for the village's true ruler. Moreau's position within the mouth of his mutated form also serves to symbolize how little mastery he has over the curse given to him by the Cadeau. In Lady D's dragon form, her body might have shrunk away, but she's still positioned on top of the dragon, and remains in a degree of control over it, even if it is only visually. Moreau being within the mouth places him in a lesser role, superfluous to the giant creature surrounding him. His position here seems to take inspiration from the real-life parasite Simathoa exigua, and big gross warnings for the next 10 seconds or so. Exigua is a louse that enters the mouth of a fish and bites away the fish's tongue, before attaching itself to where the tongue used to be and replacing it. I told you it was gross. Even in his most powerful state, Moreau's form is relegated to a mere parasite within the greater body of his mutation. Not only is his mutation little more than a malformed parody of his family's coat of arms, but he himself is just a clinger-on to that former prestige. He doesn't even get a break during his boss fight, usually a place where a villain would shine and show off the reason they're such a threat. Out of his comfort zone in the water, Moreau lurches pitifully at Ethan, dragging his body around the arena and attempting to crush his opponent with sheer girth alone. When this fails, he takes to the roof and fires a disgusting tempest of stomach acid into the air, in a last-ditch effort to melt away Ethan's body. Where Dimitrescu and Donna are able to use their powers more tactically, the only thing Moreau has left are the contents of his own stomach, his mutation refusing to grant him dignity and respect even during his final battle. After Moreau's death, Ethan is able to explore the Lord's quarters. In his tiny shack, we find a staticky TV and a plate full of cheese, showing that even before his death, Moreau was participating in undeniably human activities. Unable to think the same as he had before his mutation, unable to gain any respect among his peers, unable to make his mother proud. The last activities Moreau tried before death were attempts to regain any sense of humanity at all. Sadly, as we know, even this resulted in failure. To me, Moreau is the member of the Four Lords who elicits the most sympathy. He can't be fully excused, of course, on account of the, well, experimenting on innocent villagers and eating random fishermen, but his fall from grace makes me feel more sympathetic towards him than the more sadistic Dimitrescu and Beneviento. He's barely allowed to eke out any sort of victory against Ethan, and ends his life screaming out for his adopted mother, the one person who granted him any sense of purpose in his cursed existence. Every aspect of his design and purpose in the plot effectively emphasizes just how unfortunate a character he is, making me both sad to have to end his life and relieved that his pointless, cruel suffering can end here. So far we've talked about 3 of the 4 lords, each one of them a serious threat, yet with their own compelling psychological depth and unique motivations. Our last lord is no exception, a Machiavellian schemer with a deadly ability and the will to use it to its full potential. It's time to discuss the 4 lords' mad scientist, Karl Heisenberg. The lords that we've talked about so far are all threatening in their own way. Donna's veiled appearance evokes the terrifying image of an enigmatic ghost. Lady Dimitrescu's sheer size and strength makes her physically imposing. Moreau may be a meek and damaged individual, but his near uncontrollable mutated state turns him into a towering leviathan. Each of them remind us that, though they may be colourful characters, this is a horror game and we're meant to feel as small as possible. However, none of them can evoke a sense of guttural dread like our last lord, despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that he looks like Nicolas Cage cosplaying Father Gascoigne. Heisenberg's intimidation is primarily psychological. For a guy that talks so much, Karl gives away almost nothing regarding his true motivations, prodding and taunting Ethan from a distance as he slowly draws his plans together. Whenever he's on screen, I get the feeling that I'm being watched by a wild animal. Right now it's doing nothing, but I can't imagine what's going on inside its mind, or if and when it plans to strike. His appearance does nothing to convince us otherwise. Much of his head is hidden under that wide-brimmed ragged hat, framed by scraggly, unkempt hair reminiscent of the ferocious lichens roaming most of the village. His eyes are concealed behind a dark pair of sunglasses, making it impossible for us to get a true read on him, and making it all the more nerve-wracking whenever Heisenberg leans in real close. It might be tempting to compare him to Donna, another character who conceals much of her appearance, but Heisenberg provokes a different kind of fear. We can't see anything of Donna's body, making her more mysterious than outright scary. With Heisenberg, we can see just enough that we can get an initial impression, yet not nearly enough to get a full picture. There's plenty about his appearance for us to suspect that something is going on beneath the surface, but from just the outside we have no idea what that might be. Unlike Dimitrescu and Moreau, who quite literally wear their personalities on their sleeves, Heisenberg keeps his motives hidden away. There's clearly a cunning mind working behind those dark shades. It's just impossible to tell what it's working on and, more importantly, if it intends to do us harm. But we're not left with this impression all game. Heisenberg is indeed plotting something, and reveals his scheme to Ethan once the other lords are dead. By using Ethan's daughter's powerful abilities, he plans to destroy the woman who irreparably altered his life, Mother Miranda herself. Given this revelation, a lot of the ways Heisenberg treats Ethan up till this point start to make much more sense, and show us just how far ahead he's been planning. Heisenberg is the first lord we meet, bumping into Ethan in, bizarrely, Lady Dimitrescu's cellar. Considering the two lords' tempestuous relationship, it's hardly likely that they collaborated to spring this trap on Ethan, meaning Heisenberg had planned to meet him here all along. Shortly after, we see Miranda place Ethan's fate in Heisenberg's hands, following what is presumably a very convincing argument. At this point, it seems like he's just going to torture Ethan openly for entertainment, but watching the scene again with prior knowledge of his true intentions shows Heisenberg's actions in a completely different light. He's making sure Ethan is his responsibility, so he can push the man to his limits and see what he's made of, instead of simply killing him by accident or for sport. Even his comment to Ethan, "Let's see what you're made of," can be seen in a different light, reading more as kind of a grim encouragement as opposed to a taunt. The gauntlet that Ethan runs after also has a different context in retrospect. While at first it seemed like cheap snuff entertainment, it now feels more like a way for Heisenberg to test the strength and ability of anyone he might potentially rally to his cause. Where the paths and traps seem like linear routes to dead ends and gruesome deaths, there's always a way out, whether it's a weakened wood fence or a conveniently human-sized gap carved into the wall. The gauntlet is designed convincingly enough that Miranda or the others wouldn't grow suspicious, and yet still fits Heisenberg's purposes as a testing ground for potential recruits to his army, the perfect example of his sharp and cunning mind. After Ethan survives this initial encounter, we see little of Heisenberg until the last lord before him, Moreau, is dead. Heisenberg uses Moreau's TV set to contact Ethan, immediately following the death of his fellow lord, and soon after constructs a series of signs taunting our protagonist, pointing him in the right direction, that direction being, of course, wherever Heisenberg wants him to go. Even this yellow scrap road doesn't bring the hero to Heisenberg, and instead leads to the den of the village's lichens. This forces Ethan into a confrontation with hordes of beasts, and, finally, their dominant alpha and the former leader of the village, Urias. As a reward, Heisenberg freely gives up his piece of rose, and invites Ethan to join him in his factory, where he first makes the proposition for them to join forces and take down Miranda together. Laying low in his factory far out of the way, Heisenberg watched Ethan fight through each of his fellow lords, patiently waiting for the right time to further his plans. Out of context, it might be tempting to call this cowardice, with Heisenberg using the other lords as simply a barrier preventing Ethan from getting to him. By now though, we should think differently. It's more likely that he used them as simply another big testing ground to further evaluate our protagonist's potential, with the Lichen Lair being the last big trial before he determined Ethan to be worthy of joining him. We can tell that he was watching Ethan's progress somehow, otherwise, how would he know to gain control of Moreau's TV and contact him right after Moreau died? The other lords generally kept themselves to themselves, fussing around over their patch of land alone, but Heisenberg kept an eye on what Ethan was up to, keeping track of every lord he killed and everything else he was doing. Using the lords as bait had an additional bonus. Unlike Heisenberg, the other lords have some varying degree of genuine attachment to Mother Miranda, revering her as a literal mother or leader of some kind. Therefore, once Heisenberg decided to carry out his plans, he would be up against not only Miranda, but his superpowered siblings as well. By using them as a blockade, forcing Ethan to take them down, and only allowing Ethan into his factory after he does so, Heisenberg's killing multiple birds with one stone. He not only gets to judge Ethan's strength and potentially train him up for the oncoming fight, but he also removes various high-value obstacles that would otherwise have joined Miranda's side against him. One more example of Heisenberg's crafty nature can be seen when we visit the factory he inhabits. We meet him right at the entrance, where he reveals his plans to Ethan and tries to convince our main man to lend his and Rose's support to his war effort. In this scene, we can once again see Heisenberg's imposing personality on full display, forcing Ethan to sit as he stands above him, shades on, attempting to part convince, part intimidate our protagonist into joining forces. Only when this clearly fails does he take the shades off, showing his eyes for the first time and appealing instead to a potential human connection between them. When this doesn't work, Heisenberg drops Ethan into the tunnels beneath his factory and leaves our protagonist to the chaotic whims of his twisted, metallic creations. Just like the Lords, the metal monstrosities that Heisenberg creates are simply pawns in his game, scattered throughout the labyrinthine factory to slow Ethan down so that Heisenberg doesn't have to dirty his hands. From our first acquaintance with him all the way to the end, Heisenberg proves himself to be first and foremost a clever, manipulative schemer, holding his cards to his chest right up to the last moment. He knows how and when to use intimidation, threats, and bargaining, as well as to simply step back and let things happen. He's so good that he even outwitted the developers, who seemed to write themselves into a corner with him, and only got out with the most ridiculous Deus Ex Machina. Metal polymer composite. I mean, come on. Heisenberg combines the bestial terror of a beast stalking its prey with the brain of an insidious mastermind. These elements combine to make him one of the most intelligent and intelligently written characters in the whole franchise, and as a result, an exceptionally compelling villain overall. However, he's far from a Sherlock-style, hyper-intelligent, flawless, giga-brained Mary Sue, though he might seem it up to this point. Once Ethan makes it through the factory and confronts Heisenberg for one final battle, we see a fatal flaw at the heart of his character that reveals his big scheme to be doomed to failure right from the start. Heisenberg's mutation, like with the other Lords, causes his former personality to lose control. He laughs insanely, wallowing in the power he's gained and boasting to Ethan about how strong he is. Unlike Lady D, however, Heisenberg's madness isn't provoked by rage. He truly seems to love being a huge, powerful anime final boss, throwing out over-the-top lines like
"In the face of my steel glory!"
and attempting to finish Ethan off with a super-powered tornado special attack. He reminds me of the kid in the school playground, who always tried to pull off a Rasengan or something. Just a really juvenile approach to take towards a serious fight against someone who could, and eventually does, kill him. At first it seemed extremely tonally inconsistent both for Heisenberg and the game to do something like this, but the more I thought about it, the more I think this ultimately makes sense as an element of his character. A key piece of evidence comes in the form of his actual plan, which, when you look at it, comes to little more than increase my power level until it's higher than Miranda's, then punch her in the face. We can see this first by looking at Heisenberg's robot army. A key inspiration for the character was the figure of Frankenstein. That's Dr. Frankenstein the creator, not Frankenstein the name of the monster. This becomes apparent once you learn exactly what he's been doing in the factory, using his magnetic powers in conjunction with his knowledge of machinery and cybernetics to transform dead villagers into reanimated cyborgs. As we travel through the factory, these creations grow progressively crazier, from simple headset-wearing grunts to fully armoured, double drill-armed behemoths. We even find a voice recording of Heisenberg laughing with evil delight as one of his creations comes to life. Looking closer at the designs of these monsters, it's clear that they were built with passion as opposed to efficiency, with Heisenberg transforming average grunts into special edition action figures. It's really ridiculous how much fun he seemed to have creating these things. And though their construction is impressive, they do just look like comic book characters rather than effective soldiers. God, now I have headcanon of Heisenberg and Moreau watching Power Rangers together. Heisenberg eventually refines his creations through trial and error, experimenting in various ways with various cybernetic modifications until he finally has a force he's comfortable with mass producing. Even though his soldiers may look like something an edgy 14-year-old would draw in their school planner, they're clearly able to do some damage in battle. The main problems arise when you look at what Heisenberg exactly intends to do with his soldiers. Heisenberg wants to build up an army that's big enough to stand up to Miranda, allowing him to march on her and destroy her for good. So basically he wants to raise a huge force and Zerg-rush her to death. This is barely a sophisticated or nuanced plot and seems completely at odds with the character we've learned about up until now. We can also see his more simplistic side when it comes to how he intends to use Rose. Rather than taking advantage of whatever power Rose has in a more tactical way, Heisenberg simply tells Ethan they'll use her to grind Miranda into paste. Now, it's true that his actual plan might be a bit more sophisticated than this, but if you were trying to get Ethan on your side, wouldn't you say exactly what you intended to use his daughter's abilities to do? As it is, it seems like his plan for Rose was no different to his plan for the endless metal drones making up his army. He wanted to throw her strength at Miranda and try to overwhelm her with brute force. All of this combined shows an essential flaw in Heisenberg's personality. He wants to free himself from Miranda's control, but even with all of his established intelligence, he can't think of a better plan to take her down than building a big army and steamrolling her. You could argue that Heisenberg's plan may have worked, or at least that he isn't mistaken in thinking he could have had a chance. Having already used Ethan to cripple Miranda's forces by taking care of the other lords, a large portion of the Lycans, and the Lycan leader, maybe it makes sense for Heisenberg to assume that all he needs to do now is overwhelm her. However, I still think his plan was arrogantly bold, especially considering he doesn't know the limits of Miranda's full strength, or the power of the Megamycete that she draws upon. He just assumes bombarding her with as many soldiers as possible will work. So, while Heisenberg shows planning abilities in some areas, this part of his character shows that he can be remarkably juvenile and unsophisticated, with both sides of his personality merging and clashing like the fusing of metal and flesh in his abhorrent creations. While he's able to plan and mastermind schemes where he's in the background, we can see a remarkable tactical mind. However, when it comes to him taking action, he possesses a level of confidence in his own might that reads as outright childish, a personality flaw that eventually leads to his undoing. But we can't saddle him with all the blame. Heisenberg was taken in by Miranda as a child and raised under her, so it's possible that he, like Donna, is fundamentally underdeveloped in some areas. Obviously not to the same degree as her, but heavy enough that he hasn't emotionally matured far beyond his childish personality. Maybe this is another reason he wants Miranda's daunting shadow finally cast aside, so he can grow and flourish outside of her influence. In the end though, despite clamoring to separate himself from her, Heisenberg and Miranda aren't so different. Both tested Ethan in the same way, both use others as pawns to get what they want, and both experiment with human life to create entities that serve their purposes. They even came to the same conclusion with Rose, identifying her power as significant and wanting to use it for their own, albeit to different ends. As much as Heisenberg would hate to hear it, sometimes the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. However, there is one crucial difference between them. Heisenberg may have thought of himself as the village's grand puppet master, but Miranda was the one in charge of the whole theatre. As well as Karl played the game, Miranda's pervasive control over his life and the village as a whole was practically omnipotent. Her appearance right after his death shows that she too was watching Ethan all along, and just as Heisenberg used the other lords as bait, he occupied the same role for her. His crystallized corpse shows that even in death, all that remains of him is machine, a sign that his humanity is outlasted by the curse Miranda gave him. As his plans fail, she steps nonchalantly in the miasma of gore and wreckage that once made up his body, and advances hers to the final stage. And so, just like that, the centuries-long dynasty of the Four Lords comes to an unceremonious conclusion. Each of the lords are completely different in appearance, in motivation, and especially in personality, but they fit together perfectly somehow as an eccentric, offbeat group. They're so distinctive and well designed that it's upsetting you have to fight and kill them. Every time our relatively bland protagonist blurts out a half-hearted one-liner at the end of a battle, I just think, these near-immortal beings have ruled unopposed over the village for decades, only to be taken out by an angry dad? Granted, it turns out Ethan's a bit more than that, but it still feels like when you hear a famous ruler in history died of a cold or something. These characters were built up to be so much more than their eventual demises, inevitable as they might be. Obviously, these were the main villains in a video game, and obviously the player was always going to have to kill them. It's just a testament to how great the characters are that I genuinely felt bad once they were gone. Though they are quirky characters, I still feel like they ended up filling the role of horror game antagonists perfectly, with special credit to Donna, whose House of Horrors is possibly the most terrifying area Resident Evil has ever had. It just goes to show that you can have horror game characters with individual oddball personalities, and still do the job that horror is meant to do. Not only this, but it's also possible to center your game around a particular premise, and have characters that play subtly into that premise without it feeling overpowering or like it's being shoved in your face. Anyone that's played Village knows that at its heart is the concept of family, and nearly all the major players reinforce this concept one way or another. Ethan's core objective is to rescue his daughter, with Mother Miranda wanting to use her in order to resurrect her own long-deceased child. The Four Lords themselves, as we've discussed, come together as Miranda's surrogate family, even if, in the end, she only sees them as failed experiments. Perhaps in the absence of any true favour from Miranda, each works to create their own family. or more specifically, they use their abilities and talents to create new forms of life. For Lady Dimitrescu, it's her 3 beloved daughters reborn from the bodies of servant girls. Donna, last of her line, fills her lonely manor with endless rows of dolls, forever unspoiled by the tragedies of mortal life. Moreau, pining for Miranda's regard, subjects villagers to torturous procedures in an attempt to create vessels for her will. Heisenberg, on the other hand, attempts to raise the dead into equally harrowing existences, in order to sever the familial bond between him and the others once and for all. It's a theme ingrained deeply into Village's story and characters, but it doesn't stop there. Family represents a lot of things, but perhaps most crucially the granting of new life, a reinvigoration that ensures the old will continue through the new. Later generations may be different or unique, but they still carry within them the traces of those that came before, passed on since inception. The 4 lords of Resident Evil Village show that the series can continue to grow and develop, experimenting with new ideas while still retaining that which has helped the series persevere for as long as it has. And I can only hope that the next game has characters anywhere near as engaging, terrifying, and straight up fun as our new favourite dysfunctional family. And if you're still here, thanks very much for watching. This video took a lot, and I hope you all enjoyed it. I really did love these characters and wanted to devote a really big chunk of time just to explaining why they're so damn cool. The actors, writers, designers, everyone did such an amazing job and made Village probably my game of 2021, if we're to be honest. Capcom have really come back in a big way with this franchise, and though I was never a massive fan before, I can't wait to see what they have planned for Resi 9 and also the DLC for this game too. I'm personally hoping for a dating sim spin-off, but that's probably just me. When I was halfway through making this video, YouTube decided it really liked the Necron vid for some reason and decided to shove it on everyone's homepage. So that resulted in a huge amount of traffic. This was both exciting and terrifying, but also just kind of reassuring that people like the videos that I make. So I have decided to set up a Patreon just in case anyone wanted to support the channel in a more financial way. You can find the link in the description below. Thank you once again for all of your support. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time for a far more easygoing video. I hope.